From 1945 to 1949, the Dutch fought in what became known as the Nationale Acties, or the Indonesian National Revolution. Now, they formed a huge army of up to 180,000 men at one time, and I talk about this more in my video about the Nationale Acties and the Dutch Vietnam War as I called it, but in this video I'd like to look at the fact that of course in 1940 the Netherlands had been occupied by Germany, and until 1945 it did not have a standing army as this was demobilized by the Germans upon their victory. But by 1945 they were soon able to amass a huge number of soldiers to send to Indonesia, and I want to find out how did they manage to do this. Now the Netherlands did have a special army in the east called the KNIL, or the Koninklijk Nederlands Indisch Leger, and this had the special task of defending the Dutch East Indies. That's why the name means the Royal Army of the Dutch East Indies, and this is what they were tasked to do especially. But of course in 1942 the Japanese attacked the colony of Indonesia and took it for their own. Now most of the KNIL were captured by the Japanese and sent to internment camps, where around 25% of those ended up dying of maltreatment, of dying of hunger, and of diseases as well. But some were able to escape to Australia and to help Australian forces, which they did, and then they carried on the war fighting under Allied command and getting involved in East Timor and other campaigns throughout Asia, and then going back to Indonesia. Now in 1940, of course, the Germans invaded the Netherlands in Europe, but some of those were able to escape the eventual surrender of the Dutch army and made it to Britain, and this is where they were formed into the Princes Irene Brigade, and these were then trained in Britain and undertook training and guard duty on that side of the channel, and after 1944 they took part in going to Normandy, fighting through France, Belgium, and the liberation of the Netherlands as well. They numbered around 3,000 men in total and also went to Indonesia when the fighting broke out there in 1945. But there was also another way in which the Dutch in Indonesia brought professional soldiers along to fight. Very soon after their invasion of the Netherlands, the occupying Germans also looked at recruiting Dutch men into their army. Now this wasn't allowed into the normal army, the Wehrmacht. However, the Waffen SS, the very ideologically driven elite troops of the Germans, could have foreign volunteers, and some 25,000 Dutch men did join the Waffen SS, which served on the East Front. These were men from the Netherlands, also some were recruited from Flanders, and other so-called Nordic or Germanic countries were allowed to serve. Eventually, of course, the French and Bosnians and many others were also recruited into SS units, but from 1940 already Dutch men did start to serve in the SS on the East Front. This became known as the Division Westland, and the only way to join was to be racially pure, as they saw it, to prove your ancestry, as well as going through ideological and military training that was very, very difficult to get through. Now when Germany lost the war and the war ended, they came back to the Netherlands, but of course this was a huge issue because the Dutch government had been an enemy of Nazi Germany and they had gone and fought for the enemy. Now it's a very interesting topic this, and it's explained very well in a video by a fellow history YouTuber from the Netherlands called History Hustle. He also has a channel in Dutch. I'll leave both in the description and also a card for his video on Dutch men serving in the Waffen SS and all the issues this created after the war as well. But essentially some of these men, whether it was through coincidence because there was a draft and some of them, 25,000 is a lot of people, were then drafted into the army for Indonesia. Some ended up that way, and others may have been specifically chosen because of their military training. Now, they were extremely good fighters, but good in the ruthless sense, because they'd been sent to the Eastern Front to deal a lot of the time with partisans, and they did this in an absolutely ruthless way. They committed horrific atrocities when they were in Eastern Europe, but these were effective tactics against partisans. And of course, many of the Dutch soldiers were horrified to discover when they were out and about, and actually some accounts say that they didn't realize, because many of these ex-SS soldiers, they wouldn't tell people they had been in the SS, but they would be found out when, for example, when being called to salute, they would clap their heels together as they had done in the SS. But many of the other Dutch soldiers were horrified by this, and some even attacked these ex-SS soldiers, but later on they found that actually their combat training and experience was invaluable to them, so they were trapped in a sticky situation with what they would do with these ex-SS soldiers in the Dutch army. And they weren't the only ones to do it. The French actually had lots and lots of Germans in the French Foreign Legion, for example, and a lot of these they slipped in from the Waffen SS and these units as well, and also some ended up serving in the American army. I think he's called Larry Thorne is his Americanized name, but it was a Finnish soldier who had then first fought in the Waffen SS as well, and he's the only one buried at Arlington who served in the SS. So it's a very tricky historical situation. It wasn't only the Netherlands that had ex-soldiers who had fought for the Nazis, there were also other countries as well. While these are the examples of the soldiers who had had professional official military training, a kind of quasi-military training came from another group. And this group became known in Dutch as the Ondergrondse, or the Resistance. And these were the men and women who fought against the German occupation within the Netherlands. And towards the end of the war in 1944, they became increasingly armed, both from the Allies and from taking weapons from the German occupying forces, and became known as the Binnenlandse Strijdkrachten. And this was really an actual organization of all these loose splinter groups that had formed throughout the Netherlands, and they started to coordinate their activities more and helped with the liberation of the Netherlands. And in 1945, when war was breaking out in the Dutch colony in the East Indies, some of these were the first to go over because they'd had weapons training and experience in fighting the Germans back home. And one of these was my grandfather, who served in the Kennemer Battalion, or the Kennemers. And these had actually, before the war in Indonesia, been resistance fighters. My grandfather was first in the resistance, fighting against the Germans when the Netherlands was still occupied, and following its liberation, they acted as a kind of police to keep the social order in check when the rest of the Netherlands was being liberated. And then very soon afterwards, because they'd had some kind of weapons training and fought against the Germans back home, they were then formed into a battalion that was shipped to England and then shipped to Indonesia to fight there. Now, many of them thought actually at the first stage the Japanese still occupied Indonesia because the Netherlands was liberated before Japan surrendered, and so many of them actually, when they signed up, these resistance fighters signed up to go and fight in the east, they thought they would be fighting the Japanese, they would be liberating it from them, and they'd of course heard about how Dutch people had been put into concentration camps by them. But when they arrived, of course, it was the Indonesians fighting, and for them it was their struggle for independence, so it turned into a different conflict than many of them had imagined when they set out from the Dutch harbours. There were also, of course, volunteers who signed up to go, and I talked in my last video about why many in the Netherlands felt that they had a duty to go and fight in Indonesia, and later on there was conscription into the army as well because they needed those numbers to fill up what was needed in Indonesia, because as I said, the Dutch army had gone in 1940. There were still remnants of the KNIL and of the actual army, the Princes Irene Brigade for example, but most of them had to be trained from scratch in the event that they went to Indonesia. I should also mention here that there were also many from Indonesia itself that fought on the Dutch side. Not everyone in Indonesia wanted to be independent, and in fact there were a lot of people there who wanted to remain either with the Dutch or did not want to be part of the mainly Javanese independence struggle. Some of these came from the Maluku Islands, and these were very strong supporters of the Dutch and staying outside of this new independent Indonesia. And they actually the people from Maluku formed a kind of elite guard, let's say the Gurkhas of the Dutch forces in Indonesia, and they were feared on the battlefield for their military prowess. And actually, when the Dutch did give control over to the Indonesian government, they formed their own republic and broke away from Indonesia and asked for Dutch military support in defending it. But that is a topic for another video. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this one, because I, in my last one, tried to cover all of the Politionele Acties in one video, and so I couldn't go too in depth on why people went out to serve. But it is very interesting that just after the Second World War, the Dutch were able to scrabble together an army to go to Indonesia to what they saw as restoring order and then to fight this war. And militarily, they fought it very well. They were very successful in combating the insurrection that happened there. I also think it's very interesting that you get the very different backgrounds of the soldiers there, for better or for worse. Of course, some of it is incredibly controversial, that they also had people serving there who served the enemy, especially the fact that they were in the Waffen SS. But I think when we're talking about this, it's a very small number that actually served there. A lot of the time, and as well with those in the French Foreign Legion at Dien Bien Phu, they bigged up the number that they think actually came from the Waffen SS because it was the communists who were fighting them, and they used this as ammunition with which to attack the Western nations. But nonetheless, there were several of those who had been on the Eastern Front that went to Indonesia as well. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know in the comments below. I have been Hilbert. Check out History Hustle as well. He has some really great videos in Dutch and in English. And this has been The History.